It's a beautiful day in the bustling city as two young people enter an apartment, absently chatting. The girl, Brooklyn, whose home it is, offers her friend Chris some food. Then they hang out together, chatting and playing with her new dog. Chris suggests some names for it, as she hasn't decided what to call it yet. She eventually leads him into the bedroom by the hand, telling him it's her parents' room, but they aren't home. He is not thinking with his head, and allows her to pull him over to the window and begin undressing. It seems as though they've been together for a long time, as they happily fall onto the bed, laughing as they start to make love. Chris wakes up sharply from the pleasant dream. It's 6 years later, and he's alone in a hotel room, with half-empty glasses littered all over the bedside table, and the adjacent bed is empty. He grabs his phone, checking it, remembering that Brooklyn had been asleep there the night before. He gets dressed and heads down to the beach to look for her, confused as to where she might have gone and why she left him alone. Perhaps she just woke up early and wanted some morning sunlight. He wanders around, even asking a few beachgoers if they've seen her, but to no avail. He's beginning to get a little concerned when he arrives back at the hotel and bumps into two middle-aged people, Brooklyn's parents. It seems as though all four of them went on holiday together. They cheerily ask him how the night was, and Chris fumbles his way through the greeting, pretending everything is fine. He doesn't want them to know that it was an extremely wild night, where she was drunk and dancing and out of control. Brooklyn's father isn't stupid, though, and knows what kind of a person his daughter is. He catches quickly onto Chris's attempts at evasion, and realizes something's wrong. Chris is forced to admit that he doesn't know exactly where Brooklyn is. At her parents' dumbstruck expressions, we flash back to 2 months earlier, when the whole saga began. It's a sunny fall day in a small Canadian suburb, the trees lining the sidewalk beginning to shed their summer leaves, which blow up and swirl in the wind as Chris drives past. He takes a call from a photography company, and an angry woman asks him where he is. It seems he was on the job somewhere, but left because they hadn't paid him. When she demands he turns around, he refuses, claiming he's put in more hours than anyone else and they still won't pay. The company hangs up on him and he shakes his head in frustration that all his hard work is going to be for nothing. He pulls up at a beautiful house, presumably his parents', only to see Brooklyn at the door asking for him. She turns around and her smile lights up as she sees him arrive, running over and flinging herself onto him happily. He's shocked to see her, but grins in delight at the happy surprise. Inside, he sits tuning his guitar while she looks through his photography snaps on his laptop. She makes fun of the last job he did, promotional pictures for a local film that didn't gain much traction. But despite her cruel teasing, he laughs it off. She thinks she's joking when she puts down his aspirations and his career, calling him an amateur, but she doesn't see how deep her words cut him, because he's trying not to show it. He bites back with a self-deprecating joke about his mediocrity, then changes the subject, asking her why she's come back out of the blue. She took off a long while ago and everyone thought she was gone for good. Brooklyn isn't keen to discuss her return, deflecting Chris's question and instead asking him where his mom is. Chris hesitates, and from his silence, we can infer that something bad happened to her. When he tries to speak about it, though, Brooklyn cuts him off, not wanting to get into anything heavy, and sits back on the couch again, swiftly changing the topic again. Chris is left a little whiplashed from the encounter. It's difficult to keep up with Brooklyn's whirlwind conversation. It's clear she's trying to avoid any topics about herself, or anything too emotional, so they land back on teasing Chris once again as she makes fun of his beard. He recalls that it's been around 2 years since they've seen each other. She took off to Europe with her new boyfriend for a once-in-a-lifetime trip. She berates him for never having visited them while they traveled. Even though she was in a new relationship when she left, she knows Chris is still in love with her even now and is keeping him on the hook, afraid to let go of the safety of having him in her life. She remarks on his fear of oceans, and he rebuffs her once again, used to the back and forth of having her make fun of his insecurities and him just constantly batting her back. She informs him that she's taking her parents on a trip to Cancun, Mexico. He's shocked that she's already going on another vacation when she only just got back from her globetrotting expedition. Not stopping to listen, she barrels on and tells him that she came over to ask him to go with her. At this, Chris is flabbergasted. Brooklyn sighs and tells him her boyfriend James broke up with her in Norway and she doesn't want to go alone with her parents on this trip, especially since it's going to be on New Year's Eve. He begins to refuse, because he's already in debt with his student loans and he can't afford it. He even tries to persuade her to stay put at home for a while, rather than constantly feeling like she needs to be somewhere else. He still harbors some disappointment that she is always looking for the next adventure, the next place to go. Nothing is ever good enough for Brooklyn. He wasn't enough for her to want to stick around for. She's adamant, though, and even hints that if they were able to reconnect while they were away, she might consider staying for a while afterward. Helpless in the face of his still strong feelings for her and her blind insistence, and driven by his desire to get back together, Chris reluctantly finds himself coming around to the idea. Later, though, we see that his family is not enthusiastic about the plan. His sister Michelle and his father berate him for even considering it. They're not aware that Brooklyn and Chris ever had a relationship, as his sister rants about Brooklyn dragging Chris around like a puppy while he is happy to just be her best friend. She finds the whole situation weird. Chris appeals to his father for help, but Michelle is like a force of nature with her riled-up attitude, and he is not willing to get in the way of it, even to save his son from her wrath. That night, Chris and Michelle sit out on the porch discussing the situation alone. Michelle is still brash and feisty about it, accusing Chris of following what's in his trousers rather than what's in his head when it comes to Brooklyn. He tries to deny it but knows his sister is right, and starts to get frustrated himself, spitting out that he hasn't seen her in 2 years. He thought he'd gotten over her, but obviously, he hasn't, and he needs to try and deal with whatever lingering feelings he still has going on. Michelle is skeptical about his idea, calling him out on his stupidity, and telling him in no uncertain terms that he's not thinking clearly. Chris listens to his sister's words, but even through her insistence that he needs to find someone he can trust and be happy with, he still can't find it inside himself to give up on Brooklyn just yet. Michelle takes a swig of beer and begins to rant about her ex-wife as Chris sighs into the chilly night air. The next day, he shaves off his beard, which Brooklyn hates so much. It's obvious that although she's treated him terribly, he can't get his mind off the girl, and is willing to do anything to please her, from altering his appearance down to this insane trip to Mexico. As he's shaving, he receives a text letting him know that there's a photography job for him on New Year's Eve, which he could use the money for. Caught in a quandary, he sits down on his bed, thinking hard about which decision will be best for his future. If he turns down the job, he'll probably lose an important contact on top of declining the money for the job itself. However, if he turns down Brooklyn, she'll disappear from his life once more and he might never have another chance. Deep down, he knows what the right decision is, but he finds himself drawn to Brooklyn nonetheless, still harboring some small hope that they might get back together, that she might have changed. He looks at some old photos and reminisces about their time together in college, back to when they first met, first hugged, when he walked her home on a chilly winter night. He reads the letter she wrote to him when she broke things off, referring to him as her best friend. Then he screws it up and makes his decision. The next scene shows us which one it was. Chris sits with Brooklyn and her parents at the airport as she records their journey on her phone, her father bewildered at the concept of a selfie stick. Chris is nervous on the flight. His fear isn't just of oceans, but also of flying over them, it turns out. However, they soon make it to Mexico safe and sound, to the beautiful sparkling turquoise waves and sandy beaches of Cancun that we saw at the beginning of the movie. The pair run immediately down to the shore and throw themselves into the waves, Brooklyn pulling Chris by the hand as they play in the shallow water. That night, Brooklyn tempts Chris into taking some tequila shots in their room. Then he takes some silly shots of her on his camera before they go down for dinner with her parents. When they retire to bed, the contrast between them is stark. Brooklyn holds a bottle of wine, swigging straight from the bottle and looking unsatisfied and troubled, like she's trying to wish her cares away. Chris, oblivious to her struggle, is looking fondly through the photos on his camera, happy that they had such a wonderful evening together. Chris eventually senses something's wrong and asks about James, and Brooklyn admits she hasn't seen him since a year ago. At that, Chris sits up, confused. He thought Brooklyn had only just gotten back into town, but it turns out she'd been there for a whole year without going to see him. Without even telling him. He doesn't understand why she would even bother coming back if she didn't want to see anyone. Her still back in silence offer him no response. The following morning, the four of them head out to do water sports. Chris takes Brooklyn out on a jet ski, crashing across the Sapphire Ocean, showing us that perhaps he wasn't ever scared of the water at all. Perhaps it was just flying, and Brooklyn didn't care enough to remember. Upon their return, he runs into her father, who is chatting to a Latino man called Rex, who's a bodybuilder and quarterback at Michigan State. Drunk and enthusiastic, Brooklyn's father begins to rant about when he was younger and how he used to sleep with so many women. Chris is alarmed but too polite to excuse himself from the conversation, and when finally free, runs off to find Brooklyn in the pool, desperate to get away from hearing her father recount any more of his escapades. Rex finds the pair of them in the pool and immediately inserts himself between them, his eye caught by Brooklyn's beauty. Chris is shoved to the side and rolls his eyes. That night, he questions her about Rex, but she shrugs it off, claiming she's uninterested. As they're talking, Chris sees her father, still raging drunk, about to get engaged in a fight with a group of young men, and breaks off his conversation with Brooklyn to go and intervene before things get ugly. She doesn't even look up from her phone. Chris takes her parents to their hotel room and they try to sober her father up. Luckily, they weren't thrown out of the resort. However, Brooklyn watches on as her father drunkenly instructs Chris never to have a daughter, because most of the time, it just results in sadness. Trying her best not to cry, Brooklyn turns on her heel and walks out. With this dysfunctional family dynamic, it's clear where her issues stem from. Chris quickly goes after her without another word. The pair head to a club, where they take shot after shot, dancing with strangers and losing themselves in the music. Everything begins to get blurry as they get more and more drunk. Chris watches from the bar as Rex approaches her and dances with her on the balcony. He comments the girl sitting next to him, then engages her in light conversation. Her name is Ava. She's a local from Yucatan, but she seems worldly and knowledgeable about other cultures, enthusiastically chatting with Chris about the legend of the King's Daughters, the reason why women from Montreal are said to be so beautiful. He's pleasantly surprised to find someone he can converse so naturally with. Upon Ava's inquiry, he's reluctant to admit that it's just him and Brooklyn on the trip, because he doesn't have the time to explain their complicated circumstances and he knows how she will take it. However, their conversation is cut short by Rex slapping Brooklyn's behind, causing the situation on the balcony to get ugly. Chris gets up and, for the second time that night, intervenes to save the day. He hauls her over his shoulder and carries her out of the club, losing Ava in the crowd in the process. He brings her safely back to the hotel and drops her on the bed, but she's not ready to let the night end there. She heads into the bathroom to run herself a bath. Chris falls asleep on the bed while waiting for her to come back, too exhausted to stay awake. He awakens not long later and panics because Brooklyn isn't in her bed. She's still in the bathtub, basically passing out, and it looks like she's spent all night crying. She locks him out, but he grabs a screwdriver and comes back, determinedly jacking the door open and forcing her to get out of the bathtub and get into bed. Despite everything, his priority is to make sure she's safe. Much later, Brooklyn awakens, still wrapped in a towel. She jogs Chris awake and asks him in confusion why she's and he's frustrated, both at her inability to remember her drunkenness and her waking him up after such a long night. She's already ready for more tequila and runs off to the bathroom to get dressed. Outside, though, it's pouring rain. Rex encounters Brooklyn's father on the way into the hotel, and he doesn't hesitate to smack him in the face, warning the young man to stay away from his daughter in the future. Rex lies on the ground, nursing his jaw and wincing in pain. When the rain clears later on, they take a trip into town, Chris driving them around in a little golf buggy as they take in the sights. They stop on the Cape and talk about the previous night, where Chris finally has an opportunity to make fun of Brooklyn for her ridiculousness. Out by the ocean, with just the two of them, she's feeling vulnerable, and Chris finds the chance to ask her what's going on. Nobody gets that drunk just to have a good time. She admits that something is bothering her and explains that her trip changed her, and not for the better. She took so many substances that she ended up needing psychiatric treatment in France because she was having delusions and insomnia. That's why she's been back for a year and didn't tell anyone. She had to be pulled out of her trip early and has been in and out of various hospitals ever since. Chris is taken aback by the depth of her confession, understanding why she didn't say anything before, but sad that she didn't trust him with the truth even after inviting him out on this trip with her. She only says she didn't want him to look at her with a stigma. Being the kind and forgiving person he is, Chris simply puts his arm around her, letting it go, confident that things will be better between them from here on out. At a club later, Chris and Brooklyn spot Ava talking with a man across the room. Chris runs over to her, wanting to speak with her again after the previous night, but when he gets to the spot, she's gone. He also loses Brooklyn in the crowd. He spends a bit of time wandering around looking for her, but then catches sight of her, kissing the man that Ava was with just a few moments ago. He's shocked and disappointed, realizing that no matter what, he's never going to have a real chance with this girl. He bites back his emotions as he watches them walk away together, then goes to sit down alone with a drink, cursing his stupidity. Eventually, he can't stand it anymore and goes to find Brooklyn, asking her to leave, but she refuses to go with him, too caught up in dancing with her newfound beau. Lonely and frustrated, Chris decides to head back to the bar he saw Ava at before, desperate to get out from under Brooklyn's shadow. To his surprise, he finds Ava there, sitting by herself with a drink. He's confused because he thought she was at the other club. She confirms she was there, but she left, because the guy she was with was making her uncomfortable. Chris knows it's Artio, the same guy Brooklyn is currently dancing with, but this time, he's not letting her bad choices get in the way of him having a good time. He asks Ava why she's always alone, and she explains that she knows the bouncers all down the strip because she works as a promoter in the daytime, so at night she likes to just sit back in a corner and watch without being in a big group of people. Chris finds himself getting along with her well, and they chat for a long time before heading out of the club together for a walk in the night air. On a wall overlooking the city, Ava admits that she loves living in Cancun because it's like paradise. Her job is hard work, but she loves it because she gets to talk to people all day long, and it allows her to stay in that beautiful place. Chris admits that he's never actually been anywhere else other than Canada and Mexico. This is his first time in another country. Ava finds it adorable, and the two flirt briefly before she asks him about his photography. He's taken aback, never having been asked seriously about his profession before. Brooklyn always treats it like a joke. Sobering up a little, he recounts to Ava the story of how his mom passed away from cancer a few years back. He realized afterward that they didn't have many photos together with her, of him and Michelle as children, so he took up photography as a way of trying to make up for all those lost, uncaptured years. It's a way to immortalize the years he's living now. Not having expected the night to take such a profound turn, Ava apologizes for having brought it up. Chris doesn't mind, though, actually feeling a sense of relief at having had the chance to talk about it. He feels like he can breathe easier when he's around her. He tries to draw the conversation back to the present, but Ava wants to know about his relationship with Brooklyn. Reluctantly, he divulges that they have a past, but they're just friends now and that's all there is to it. Ava isn't fooled, but doesn't press him for more details. She tells him she needs to head off because she's got work early, and Chris tries to go in to kiss her, but she pulls back quickly. Embarrassed that she led him on, she quickly qualifies that she's not in the place for anything romantic right now, and she wants to take the night for what it was. A brief moment of shelter in the insane storm of life. She helped him out of his slump after he saw Brooklyn making out with Artio, and that's all it needed to be. She heads off into the night, leaving Chris feeling torn and wistful. He returns to the hotel as dawn peeks through the window and promptly passes out. Now, we are all caught up on the timeline, and we return to the scene at the beginning of the movie. Brooklyn is missing, and her parents are losing their minds at her disappearance. Her father is irritated with Chris for leaving her alone, but her mother understands that he can't be held responsible for her if she isn't looking after herself. As her father goes to ask the front desk for help, her mother stays behind to talk to him, apologizing for putting him through all this without even telling him how bad Brooklyn has been at home after her episode in France. Chris, ever optimistic, is sure they'll find her and everything will be fine. He returns to the room to wait in case she comes back, looking out over the beach in desperation. By the afternoon, they still haven't heard anything, and Chris is beginning to get frantic, remembering Ava's words that Artio made her feel uncomfortable and imagining the worst has happened. Suddenly, there's a knock at the door, and he pulls it open in relief to see a bedraggled, but alive, Brooklyn standing behind it. She walks in and hugs him tightly, apologizing for the scare. While putting makeup over a bruised eye, she explains that she tried to bring Arturo back to the resort, but they wouldn't let him in, and when the security stopped him, they got in a fight and got taken to a jail cell overnight. Chris is apoplectic, drilling into her that it's been almost 12 hours since she went missing, and they were frantic. Brooklyn is angry that he told her parents about it, but he's unable to believe that she is treating all this so casually. Brooklyn's mom arrives at the door and she quickly snuggles up in bed, pretending to be tired, and lies to her that she was just snuggling with Arturo in a hammock to watch the sunrise and they fell asleep. Her mother believes her lie and goes to inform her father she's back home safe. Chris watches it all, incredulous at Brooklyn's blatant lying. After her mom leaves, he lay it all onto her, accusing her of not caring about anything at all. He feels betrayed by her terrible judgment and the fact she's only thinking about herself, and not considering how her actions affect him or anyone else. He storms out, needing some air and ignoring her weak protests. Unfortunately for him, though, on the way to the elevator, he's stopped by a member of staff asking for Brooklyn. It turns out she's getting kicked out of the resort after her run-in with the security guards. She reacts with anger upon hearing the news, then goes and tries to plead with the head of security for another chance, but the woman is firm and refuses to allow her to stay. Frustrated, Brooklyn walks off, and Chris is once again left trailing behind her, caught trying to clean up her mess. As they're trying to discuss what to do, Brooklyn's mom approaches them from down the beach, and Brooklyn collapses into Chris's arms, sobbing, knowing she has no choice but to tell the truth. Her father is angry, but Brooklyn bites back at him, accusing him of lying to them about being sober. Her mother cuts into the middle of the fight, proclaiming that there are no other hotels available, and that Brooklyn has no choice but to go home. They are going to stay at the resort and finish their vacation, and it's up to her daughter to deal with the consequences of her poor decision-making. Chris rides with Brooklyn in the taxi, the rain pounding down on the windows, neither of them speaking to the other in the aftermath. However, they don't go to the airport. It turns out that once again, Brooklyn has lied, and she has a credit card her parents don't know about, with which she's booked another hotel nearby. Chris is just about done with her, but she pleads for him not to give up on her, because she needs to prove to her mom and herself that she's strong enough to do this and be on her own. She takes Chris's hand, once again playing with his emotions, asking him to get his things and meet her at the new hotel later that day where they can have time to themselves, hinting that things might get romantic once again. She even blows a kiss back at him. Chris gets back into the taxi, frustrated at being manipulated once again, no longer even knowing the right thing to do. Should he go with Brooklyn, throwing caution to the wind once again and believing in that last shred of hope that there's humanity in her? Should he tell her parents, betraying her ruse and getting her the help he believes she so desperately needs? Or should he ignore it all and try to do something for himself for once, finding Ava, the mysterious girl who listens to his stories and cares about him? To make things even more confusing, he receives a text from his employer. The New Year's gig is open, if he wants it and can get there on time. He calls Michelle, desperate for a voice of reason, and explains the whole story. Michelle, though, doesn't have the answers for him, asking him instead what he wants. It's the first time anyone has asked him that question, and it gives him pause. What does he want? His heart is still hung up on Brooklyn, even though his brain knows it's a terrible idea, and he laments that he's not been able to get over her since high school, because she's always in his head. His sister advises him that if he wants to go after Brooklyn, he has to make it known to her, make his move and put himself out there rather than hanging around her like a puppy. If he doesn't, then he should give up on it and go and have some fun while he's on vacation, because all Brooklyn does is make him miserable. Either way, he needs to decide, because things can't keep going on the way they have been. After listening to her speech, Chris seems to have finally made up his mind. That afternoon, Brooklyn waits at her new hotel as Chris arrives with his bag. It looks like, after everything, he decided to go to her. She sees him coming and screams in delight, running to hug him and crashing him to the floor with momentum. However, the very next scene shows Chris with her parents at the old hotel. Her father is explaining his comment from the other night with a heavy heart, that he hated having a daughter because he didn't know how to protect her, how to keep her safe from the world. Her mom explains the true extent of Brooklyn's delusions and how she truly hoped that things were better, but it's obvious now that the whole trip was a mistake. In the end, it seems Chris chose to tell them the truth in the hope that they would be able to help him handle the situation. However, her mother warns him that if they turn up at the hotel, Brooklyn might try to run, so right now, she needs to believe that Chris is on her side. As he's waiting for the taxi, he spots Ava leaving the hotel. She's been dropping off some leaflets for her work. She asks if Chris will be coming to the party she's hosting, but when he's hesitant, she doesn't pry, believing it's because he's just not interested in her. Surprising him, she kisses him on the cheek before she departs, leaving him more torn than ever. Back in the present, Chris is at the new hotel with Brooklyn, enacting the plan he and her parents put in place. He firmly tells her that he's in charge now, and if he's going to stay there with her, then she's going to listen to him. Impressed with his newfound confidence, Brooklyn agrees. They sleep the night away, and upon waking up the next morning, Brooklyn presents him with a waterproof camera cover so he can take photos in the ocean. She claims it's a gift as thanks for all the madness she's put him through. Touched by her thoughtfulness, he forgives her, pulling her into a hug, determined to make the most of their last couple of days together. He leaves her sleeping in the room and heads down to the pool with his new camera cover, filming some underwater footage and having a great time. Then he takes a boat out snorkeling, recording the fish below his feet. Back at the hotel later on, though, he tells Brooklyn it isn't the same without her there with him, and gets her up out of bed to come and join him. They play together in the water, finally having the vacation that they should have had from the beginning, meeting the other guests, and generally having a whale of a time. He takes her out to the same snorkeling spot, holding hands as they swim, and she blows him an underwater kiss. In the room later on, though, it all starts to go wrong again. They're getting ready to go out that night when Brooklyn comes out of the shower, and has one of her manic episodes, believing that Chris is trying to peek at her, slapping him repeatedly and yelling at him to stop looking at her. He grabs her, annoyed, and pushes her onto the bed, telling her to stop it, and she freaks out completely, seemingly terrified, then bursts into sudden laughter. Chris firmly maintains that she has to stop hitting him, and without warning she pulls him on top of her, asking if he loves her. He's blindsided by the question, unable to answer, as she laughingly kisses his neck over and over again, riling him up and at the same time confusing him completely. He knows he's being led on, but he doesn't even know what's going through her head. She straddles him, then leans down and captures him in a light kiss. Just as Chris believes he has a grasp on the situation, she proclaims she believes he wasn't looking and gets off him, leaving him bewildered. It seems she's still a whirlwind even now. Chris is still caught up in the center of her toxic web. At dinner, Brooklyn asks again if Chris loves her, then proposes that if they both get to 40 without being married, they should marry each other. Amused, Chris toasts to that, believing that she's finally come around. They get ready for a brilliant New Year's Eve together, forgetting all the madness that's gone before and trying to believe in a fresh new start. When they're out, though, Arturo appears at the bar and Brooklyn greets him enthusiastically, a little too enthusiastically, as Chris watches on, unable to believe that once again, he's fallen for her lies. She never intended to make him a priority, and she doesn't feel the same way. She's just keeping him hanging on a string. Finally, the mist clears and he sees her game for what it is. At that moment, he spies Ava alone on another balcony. He waves at her, and in the interim, Arturo and Brooklyn disappear from the bar. He remembers what happened the last time she left with him, and goes down to look for them in a panic. He sees them from the dance floor, Arturo getting aggressive and trying to pull Brooklyn out of the club against her will. Tearing his eyes away from Ava, dancing alone on the balcony, Chris goes to help her. Although he's feeling frustrated and betrayed, he can't leave her in danger. Together they take down Arturo and flee the scene. As they walk back to the hotel, Brooklyn rounds on Chris, blaming him for everything because he disappeared when Arturo showed up. Finally, having had enough, Chris lets loose on her, all the bottled-up rage from the last few days boiling over. Brooklyn, though, is still only thinking about herself and can't see anything from his point of view. She accuses him of treating her like they're still in high school, that he's been sitting in the friend zone and doing nothing with his life while judging hers. Her words hit a little too close to home, and Chris is left standing there on the beach as she walks away from him, watching the New Year's fireworks go off in the sky as he reflects on the choices he's made. Back in Canada, the group arrives home. Chris thanks Brooklyn's parents for the trip, the atmosphere thick and frosty. Brooklyn walks him to the door and tries to explain herself, but Chris has had enough. She's still not ready to apologize for the things she's put him through, and he's not ready to listen to her, either, as she insists she's no longer got a problem. From inside the car, Brooklyn's parents watch on, and her mom fears that they're going to lose Chris. Outside, Brooklyn shakes her head and stomps away, denying that there's anything wrong with her. Chris sits on his bed, contemplating deleting the photos of their trip to finally erase Brooklyn's influence from his life, as her mom watches her in despair as they drive away. 9 months on, Chris is in the back of a cab pulling up to the airport. He makes his way in, bag packed, and checks his watch. He sees someone ahead of him has dropped something on the floor and goes to give it back to her, only to discover it's Brooklyn. The two haven't seen each other since the end of the disaster trip in Cancun. Feelings seem to have softened between them as they converse somewhat civilly. Brooklyn mentions that she's heading out east to start school again. Chris admits that since everything happened, he found out about Rue, the namesake of the tattoo that Brooklyn has on her back. It turns out that she and James had a daughter while they were traveling, but due to his financial situation and her mental issues, she had to be given up for adoption. Now, she's finally started getting her life back together and she's acquired visitation rights, which she's thrilled about, because she'll get to have a relationship with her, even if she isn't allowed to raise her. Chris simply smiles, happy that she's started to get everything back on track. He draws up his courage and admits to her that he's been in love with her for a long time, and he was during that whole trip to Mexico as well. He thought he was over her, he thought he was strong enough, but he wasn't. He apologizes for his behavior, because he knows now he shouldn't have gone on that trip. Brooklyn apologizes as well, knowing she only brought him to keep her in check because she wasn't okay at the time. She used him, and she's finally admitting it. The pair of them hug goodbye for the last time as Brooklyn tells him she loves him. He has a daydream of pulling back and kissing her passionately, seeing what their lives could have been like together. They could have been going on their honeymoon, laughing, hopelessly in love as they looked out the window of their hotel room at the sunset, before making love all night long. Instead, the vision recedes as he lets her go for the final time and bids her farewell, knowing they both have their own lives and will be better off without each other. We see Ava receiving a bouquet of roses as Chris reminds himself that for everything Brooklyn was to him, she wasn't the one. Brooklyn FaceTimes her daughter from the airport before she gets on the flight, sobbing as she sees they've made a sign to welcome her. She's starting a new phase of her life now, free of the toxicity that held her back and ready to give her everything towards becoming a better person for Rue. Chris, meanwhile, arrives back in Mexico as he sees Bao waiting for him, reminding himself that everything he went through with Brooklyn, all the heartache, tears, and frustration, feeling like he was drowning in quicksand, was ultimately worth it, because, in the end, it led him to her. They kiss and get in the back of the van together, ready to tackle their next great adventure.